Everyone wants to make better decisions, but when the inputs are wrong, the outcomes can't be right. So let's fix the data, the logic, and the thinking together. I'm Dr. Denaige and this is The Good Think. Today we're tracing one of the oldest operating systems in human history, the patriarchy, not to destroy it, but to understand what it's still doing to us. Hello, thinkers. Thanks for joining me today. You know, the topic of patriarchy is fascinating to me. I love the patriarchy, and I love to hate the patriarchy. I like to talk about it, to tease it, to poke fun at it, and I totally have a feminist sweatshirt that I wear around my small little town just to kind of shake things up out there. Because honestly, there's some really great stuff when it comes to the patriarchy, but there's also some absolutely exhausting stuff about it. And right there, that is the patriarchy problem. And it's not that it exists, but that it's complicated emotionally, historically, linguistically, and our modern day reductionist habits have really turned the word patriarchy into a kind of social grenade. Its meaning has shifted so much over time that its value as a word has become trivial. Now, you'll all remember when the word nice became so overused that it started to mean nothing at all. And you actually probably, like me, started to avoid saying it because it was just a filler word. It might have been polite, but it was empty, hollow, not very thoughtful. And as humans, we want our words to mean more than that. And so that's what happens when a word becomes a victim of something called semantic drift. It stops meaning anything. And I think that is where we are today with the patriarchy. So before we talk about what's wrong with it or what's right with it, maybe we need to ask what it even is, where it came from, what it's supposed to describe, and what happened to it along the way. The word patriarchy has been around for centuries, and it comes from two Greek roots, patria, which means family or lineage, and archy, meaning rule or order. So literally, this would mean the rule of the fathers. Now, you'll recognize other words built from these same root words. From patria, we get words like patriot, patrimony, and paternal, words that describe and define family lines. Now, genealogists will appreciate this because these terms are really helpful for specificity and not judgment. We talk about our paternal and maternal grandparents with those words simply to clarify quickly which side of the family we mean. Paternal meaning coming from our father's side, and maternal meaning coming from our mother's side. This kind of language was meant to trace inheritance, to promote efficiency. It was never intended to be a moral judgment. Now, from archy, we get words like monarchy, anarchy, and hierarchy, each of these describing different ways that power and order are arranged. And so when you think about it, these root words really reveal something about how humans have always understood authority and order. And that's because it's not just about who holds that, but the how of its structure. So we're looking at the system itself. Now, in its earliest use, patriarchy, like I said, it wasn't a judgment. It was actually just a descriptive word. In early Christian traditions, patriarchs were the heads of churches and councils, spiritual authorities. And in early sociology, thinkers like Max Weber used patriarchy to describe systems of personal rule based on tradition. That's the households, the monarchies, the tribes. All of this before modern bureaucracy and democracy started to take over. So this organizing principle, it helped to explain lineage, law, inheritance, social order, how things are passed from one generation to the next, all very, very important for the time. So for most of history, patriarchy didn't mean men are bad. It simply meant this is how the structure works. Now, it is worth noting that patriarchal systems weren't the only systems humans invented. Across cultures, you'll also find matrilineal or matriarchal societies. Those are where lineage, property, or spiritual leadership are passed through women. So among the Mosua of China, I have no clue if I'm saying that right, but within this group, families are organized around the maternal line. And then there's another group in Indonesia who is also matrilineal, with women controlling inheritance and family property. And this also occurs in many indigenous nations, including several in pre-colonial North America, where clan mothers or female elders held authority equal to or even greater than male chiefs. And you'll find examples of this all around the world throughout time. So no, patriarchy isn't strictly a white man's idea. It's actually a human idea that emerged wherever strength, protection, and lineage became tied to property and inheritance, which for much of human history meant survival. But Western patriarchy, shaped through Judeo-Christian and European traditions, became the global template largely because of colonialism. It was exported along with language, law, and religion as the default structure of civilization. And while the word patriarchy is Greek, the concept of male-centered authority has parallels everywhere you look. In China, Confucian texts use terms that mean father's authority and literally translate into the family head system. In Indonesia, similar ideas presented in expressions that could be translated as the father's rights. So even though the vocabulary is different, the framework is similar, and societies across time have wrestled with the balance between lineage, leadership, and loyalty. But then the world changed. Industrialization, capitalism, colonialism, democracy, feminism, all of this has reshaped how we see leadership, power, and worth. And by the 1970s, feminist theories had taken hold of old sociological terms and turned them into something new, something systemic. Writers like Kate Millett and Gerda Lerner used patriarchy to describe not just family structure, but a social order that privileged men and masculine traits, while marginalizing everyone else. And so they weren't exactly wrong, but they weren't complete. At the time, laws and institutions literally treated women as dependents. You couldn't get a credit card without having your husband's signature or at least a male authority. Employers routinely fired women for becoming pregnant. Marital rape wasn't even legally recognized. And so when feminist theory said this system is patriarchal, well, it was naming something that desperately needed a name at the time. But it is important to pause here and make the research distinction that correlation, my friends, is not causation. So just because patriarchy existed alongside injustice doesn't mean that every injustice was caused by patriarchy alone. There's many systems, economic, religious, colonial, and racial, all operating together that reinforce each other in messy and overlapping ways. But still, the term stuck. And once it entered into public conversation, it became normalized through borderless application. And don't think that patriarchy is the only linguistic casualty of this cultural overreach. We're watching other words lose their precision right now. Words like trauma, gaslighting, narcissism, toxic, even diversity. They were once tools of description, but now they've been used and applied and stretched so far beyond what their original word meaning is that they've lost their diagnostic value. They've gone from being analytical to emotional, and that loss has a direct impact on how we communicate with each other. So when the word patriarchy really sort of left academia, it lost its borders. And that's a dangerous thing because academia, for all of its flaws, acts as a custodian of meaning. Just like the knowledge keepers across indigenous and ancient traditions, scholars preserve the integrity of interpretation. And maybe it'll help to think of it this way. A priest is trained to interpret scripture. A linguist is trained to interpret language. And a scientist, well, they're trained to interpret data. And each role protects understanding of information and knowledge from distortion. And so when our knowingness of the world becomes shaped by the uninformed, we all become vulnerable to confusion. And if you're reading between the lines here, that's exactly what's happening right now in the era of the internet and social media, where popularity has replaced peer review. When words migrate into pop culture, they become unguarded. They can evolve creatively or mutate carelessly. And that's exactly what's happened here. And if you think about that, it's kind of an ironic development, really, because the loss of certain patriarchal traits, things like order, hierarchy, and custodianship, has also meant the loss of systems that protect knowledge itself. So dismantling the hierarchy of knowledge keeping in the name of freedom of information has paradoxically eroded the integrity of information. Wild. So even here, the story is complicated, but the evidence shows that patriarchy isn't exclusively good or bad. And in this case, losing part of its structure has been a loss for all of us. Patriarchy stopped being a sociological term and started to become a symbolic one. And it became a catch-all villain, a word that could explain both war and who does the dishes. And that's the trouble with words that sort of take on too much, that have been expanded in their meaning and their application too far. They collapse under their own weight. Patriarchy became less about lineage and leadership and more about frustration, about injustice, exhaustion, and the ways people feel unseen or unheard inside the systems they live within. And so here we are, using one word to talk about everything from politics to parenting, from violence to validation. And maybe that's why conversations about patriarchy feel so impossible. Maybe it's because we're not talking about the same thing at all. So now that we've traced where the word comes from, let's talk about what it actually does. Because patriarchy, the system, not the slogan, is remarkably consistent. And you can see evidence of it everywhere you look, across architecture, economics, politics, medicine, even in the smallest, most ordinary corners of your life. You just have to look around. Our world was literally built to fit the average man. From the temperature of office buildings calibrated to the metabolic rate of a 40-year-old male, to the crash test dummies that set vehicle safety standards based on male body proportions, even NASA's early spacesuits were designed without room for a woman's hips. We're often told to meet these facts with outrage, but most of them weren't malicious. They were just acts of default. When men were the ones designing, building, governing, funding, and actually using these systems, well, of course, they built for what they knew. And that wasn't seen as bias, it was seen as efficiency. The result wasn't so much of a gap as it was simply a reflection of the worldview of the time, a worldview that assumed its own universality. And to be fair, that worldview was born in a context of urgency and expansion. So if we think about what life was actually like in the 18th and 19th centuries, we'll understand that the world was being mapped and measured for maybe the first time, really. Ships were charting new coasts, explorers were crossing continents, wars were redrawing boundaries faster than atlases and those map makers, cartographers, could keep up. Industrialization was transforming survival into science. Factories, railways, telegraphs, everything was developing. Everything was about speed, precision, control, and who was going to come out as the leader. Now, humanity was busy mastering its environment, not concerned about what its inner life was dealing with. Emotional health wasn't a priority because they were still uncertain about their own physical safety. So people built systems around what mattered most then. And at that time, progress meant order. Speed and safety were triumphing over inclusion and introspection because they just didn't matter. And that is the story of patriarchy in a nutshell. It's not hatred, it's not heroism, it's just habit, a kind of natural progression, a pattern of decision-making that reflected the limits and the priorities of its age. So let's take something as simple and revolutionary as anthropometrics, and that is the science of studying and measuring human bodies. Now, in the 19th century, researchers like Alphonse Bertillon and Adolphe Quetelet pioneered ways to standardize body measurements for clothing, tools, military gear, even public seating. You ever wondered why the bench seats are a specific width? Well, it comes down to anthropometrics. And this was groundbreaking. The idea that human variation could be studied, averaged, and engineered around. And so they measured soldiers, factory workers, laborers, mostly men, of course, because that was the population available to the researchers. And that data became the template for everything from uniforms to furniture. And that goal that they had at the time, it wasn't exclusion, it was improvement. So it made sense then. And if we're honest, it actually still makes sense now, because some knowledge is better than none. But like any systems built on averages, it ages. New information becomes available, just like in the research of today. Now, the model that once represented everyone slowly has revealed bias, and not just for gender, for geography, ethnicity, age, and even time. In Northern Europe, average heights rose nearly 4 inches between 1900 and 2000. And in Japan, post-war nutrition actually changed body proportions so dramatically that furniture and buildings had to be redesigned. And in North America, rising obesity rates have shifted average body size faster than infrastructure can adapt, affecting things like airplanes, theater seats, even the size of your hospital bed. So even within one lifetime, human design data can become obsolete. So when we look back, our goal really shouldn't be to tear down the achievements of those who came before us, but to understand them in context, to see how each solution made sense for its time, but to remember that relevance, like progress, always has an expiry date. And we got to go back and take a look at things and see how they apply as time goes by. So this is one pattern that you can see in medicine quite easily. For centuries, the male body was medicine's baseline. Symptoms, dosages, and risk factors were all measured on male test subjects, and women's bodies were treated as unpredictable outliers. Even today, women wait longer for pain relief in emergency rooms, and their heart attacks are more likely to be misdiagnosed. We still don't understand the female body with the same kind of certainty and clarity as we do the male body. But before we turn that into another villain story, let's be clear that the problem isn't the patriarchy. It's the behaviors within what is a patriarchal system. Habits of thought and practice that once made sense, but maybe have lingered a little bit too long. And those habits don't only affect women, they shaped men too. Masculinity was conditioned to ignore pain, both physical and emotional. So while men were taught to kind of push through things to fix rather than to feel, that wasn't only the patriarchy influencing this outcome. It was economics, religion, war, and biology, all reinforcing the same logic that endurance equals strength. And strength was prioritized over most of everything else. So while the patriarchy has amplified it by rewarding stoicism and punishing vulnerability, we know and understand that that's not the full story. Men delay diagnosis, they resist help, and they cope through work, alcohol, or silence often. Women are still told or suggested that their pain doesn't matter, while men are being told that their pain shouldn't exist. And so rather than having us judge that as oppression, which assigns blame, let's recognize it for what it is and call it by a more appropriate term. And I think that's probably a design flaw, a mismatch between what humanity needs now and what once worked. And design flaws always will show up in economics. And we can see that the modern workplace has been built on the assumption that someone else was at home doing everything else, the cooking, the cleaning, the caregiving, the community glue, and that someone else was almost always a woman. When women entered the workforce en masse during the world wars, it wasn't because patriarchy evolved. It was because patriarchy was at war. Men left and women stepped in all over the world, running factories, farms, and offices. The system had to expand in order to survive. But then, when those soldiers came home, the social contract snapped back, or at least it tried to. And that return was devastating on both sides. Men came home from the front lines carrying trauma that no one knew how to name, how to treat, how to care for. They were expected to just step back into their lives, to reclaim their authority, to lead households, manage emotions, and provide stability, while they were barely able to process what they'd seen and what they'd been through. Women, meanwhile, had to keep society functioning. They'd built confidence, community, and capability, and they weren't willing to step back into dependency. And so it was an impossible reunion. These two wounded halves of the same system were each being asked to return to roles that no longer fit their hearts and souls any longer. And this happened at a really big scale. The old hierarchy didn't know what to do with human pain. It only knew how to reassert order. And so that moment wasn't just a revolution, it really was a pivot point in this whole system. The caretakers had become the workforce, but the system never updated to fit that new reality. And from then on, the world really kind of assumed a dual income model, but it kept running on single income logic. And so what do I mean with that? Well, we ended up with women doing both jobs, the paid labor that keeps economies running and the unpaid labor that keeps families alive and running. And like every evolution of patriarchy, it worked for a while until the bias revealed itself. And that's not in just the patriarchal system, it's in any system. Add enough time and things won't work as well. And that's because the things within the system change. So until we've had enough distance to see the ripple effects, which in this case were the loss of the family presence, strain on families, exhaustion of women, loss of community volunteers, and a guilt of parents who felt stretched too thin and weren't able to raise their own children. It changed the world as we know it. And that's the patriarchal problem in a new light. When the system becomes inefficient, women often are the ones that carry the cost first in that system. And so now, full circle, we're watching many women who are exhausted by overfunctioning, long for partnership that feels balanced again, for a version of masculinity that provides stability without dominance, for men who can lead with care and strength that feels like safety instead of simply control. And that is the paradox. We don't actually want the patriarchy gone. It's a great system that adds a lot of value and order and understanding. We actually want it healed. We want it redefined. We want it to keep its spine, but soften its grip. And so once you start to see the pattern, you can start to redesign it. So after all of that, the history, the systems, the stories, what is patriarchy really? Because it isn't a man. It isn't a villain hiding in a boardroom. It's a structure. It's a pattern that once served order and now struggles with meaning. Patriarchy is the inherited architecture of power, designed in a different age for a different world by people doing the best they could with what they knew and what was good at the time. And like any old building, some parts are beautiful, some parts are broken, and some are a little bit dangerous if left unexplored. And so patriarchy is not simply the rule of men, it is the rule of an outdated logic, one that prioritizes hierarchy over harmony, efficiency over empathy, certainty over curiosity, when really what we need is a blend of all of that. It's not either or, it's and. And that is the patriarchy problem. Not that it exists, but that we've stopped seeing it as a system that you and we can evolve. When we demonize it, we lose the wisdom of its structure. When we romanticize it, we ignore the pain that it caused. But when we study it, when we look at it clearly, we can separate the bones worth keeping from the fractures that need healing. Because I think the truth is that patriarchy was never just about men. It's about humans, about how we organize our fear, how we have made rules around protection, purpose, and belonging, how we've created sense out of complexity. It's about what happens when power becomes tradition and tradition forgets how to adapt and consider what it's actually there for in the first place. So maybe healing patriarchy isn't about overthrowing it at all. Maybe it's about redesigning it, rebuilding the systems that honor both strength and softness, both order and empathy. And that's what we're here to do, to think about our thinking, to look past the noise, to understand the roots beneath the rhetoric. And that's because once you can see that pattern, you can start redesigning it. And that, my friends, that's the good thing.